You'll need a 4mm Allen socket to take out the 3 bolts that connect the housing of the fan to the motor itself. I like to use the housing to collect all the bolts we'll take out throughout the rebuild. You'll need a Phillips head screwdriver along with a pair of needle nose pliers to loosen the screws that clamp on the fan. The best way to take off the fan is to use a crowbar and a rubber mallet. Put the crowbar all the way down on the shaft and wiggle and hammer it until the fan just pops off. Throughout the rebuild, all the parts that we'll reuse, like the fan, make sure to clean with acetone or brake clean. You'll need a 6 Allen socket on the impact driver to get these off. These were fairly loose, so it came off easy, but typically it won't be. You'll need to get a ratchet most of the time to get these off. The impact driver will not be strong enough, no matter how charged it is. The easiest way to do this is to grab a pair of channel locks and a 22mm socket on a impact driver. You can do this while the motor is inside the go-kart, but since I'm doing a motor rebuild, I already had it out and I was going to change it anyways. Next, you'll need to get a bearing puller. This one I like a lot because I can attach it straight to my impact driver. This is what it should look like if you have it on correctly. The battery was almost dead on my impact driver, so it didn't have all the power it needed to take off the sprocket on its own. So I had to grab a ratchet as well as a pair of needle nose pliers to jam between the bearing puller and the thread to stop it from spinning while I put more weight on it. Thankfully, this one popped off fairly easy. You'll need a 4mm Allen socket next to get off the 8 bolts that hold on the lid to the motor housing. To get the rotor core out, you'll need to get the rubber mallet and hit the shaft until it starts to come out. Once the rotor core starts to come out a little bit, you can take off the metal lid of the motor housing. Make sure to inspect the rotor core for any scratches or dents. This one's relatively okay. We don't have any brand new ones because they're expensive to get, so we'll have to reuse this one. The wire bundles on the inside of the motor are called the stator core. There is as well the encoder bearing that tells the computer how fast it is going. There's a special washer that you have to make sure is always flush against the encoder bearing or the motor will not work when you put it back in. To get the bearings off the rotor core, you'll need to get a larger bearing puller. This one you can use a 17mm socket on the impact driver to make quick work of the bearing. In this next clip, I show you the wrong bearings to use. The top box is correct, but the bottom one isn't. You can ignore that bottom box. This is the actual one that you'll need. The best way to put on the new bearings is to get 3 old axle bearings that you're not afraid to get damaged. You'll need to put the correct bearing for the side on first, and then 2 axle bearings on top. You'll use the rubber mallet and the hammer to try to jimmy the bearings down. Eventually, the 2 axle bearings won't be tall enough and you'll need to put a third. The axle bearing is the same diameter as the shaft, so you'll need to use the bearing puller again to get off the axle bearing that you accidentally put on the shaft. You'll do the same thing for this side, but I think the diameter on the side of this shaft is slightly different, so you might not have to use the bearing puller to get off the axle bearings. Next, make sure to clean off the rotor core. The cleaner it is, the better it'll work. I didn't have any acetone laying around, so I used some tool cleaner. I could have used brake clean as well. It's really whatever you have nearby. Make sure though, if you have the microfiber cloths nearby, it'll do the best job in getting all that grease and dirt off. Once you're done cleaning the rotor core, make sure to use the rubber mallet to gently, very gently, hit in the rotor core into the encoder bearing. You don't need to hit the rotor core all the way in yet. We'll use the bolts that hold in the metal lid to the motor housing to pull it in all the way. You just need to get it close enough to where the bolts are long enough to hit the threads of the hole. You'll need the 4mm T-handle to tighten in all these bolts. I like to go side to side so it evenly ports in the rotor core. What I like to do is tighten them all the way until they're hand tight with the T-handle, and then turn it off 1/4 of a turn. To put on the fan, gently hit it in with the rubber mallet. Be very gentle. I've broken a fan before by accidentally hitting it a little too hard. Just like taking off the fan, you'll need to use a Phillips head screwdriver and some needle nose pliers to tighten down the screw that holds the clamp onto the fan. Use the 4mm T-handle to tighten the 3 bolts that hold the fan housing onto the motor just until they're hand tight. Nothing more is needed. Easy. These have a line in the middle that lines up with the keyway that sometimes need to be replaced, but this one didn't, and it slides on pretty easy. Make sure to put on the locking washer and then the nut, and then use a 22mm socket to put it on real quick. I've noticed you want minimum 2 threads showing, but my impact driver again was almost dead, so it didn't have enough power, so I have to use a wrench and a channel lock to hold the sprocket from spinning, as well as using my own strength with a ratchet. No matter how frustrated you get with the sprocket, don't ever use the channel locks to grip onto the teeth of the sprocket. It's a good way to ruin a brand new one. Once you have the nut tightened on a minimum of 2 threads, make sure when you get the motor back in the go-kart that the sprocket lines up near perfect with the gears of the differential. Unless something happens, this is the only time the motor should be out of the go-kart for a year and a half. So make sure to clean it real well, because we'll only be spraying it down with the air compressor from now on once it's in. I again used just some tool cleaner and a microfiber rag to get it cleaned up.
Oh yeah, acetone. I'm doing pretty good. Hey, work yesterday. Did you have to work yesterday? That sucks, dude. Yeah, it was a ton of fun. Thanks for having us over. Pretty fun party. What's up? Oh. Fine. Okay.
I should have really sprayed the stratter core down while I still had it all apart, but you know, hindsight is 20/20. Make sure to have this motor mount correctly lined up with the other one, or you'll have to fix it again when you realize it when you put the motor inside the go-kart. These bolts that hold in this motor mount get loose really easy, so there's no such thing as too much Loctite on these. Use the 6 Allen socket on the impact driver until it's no longer spinning to put these bolts in.